We're going to be talking about wiring today. Apparently Claire is not. Now, there are two types of wire that is used in bonsai, but they have different properties. You're going to find copper to be the most common. Now, what we use copper for is wiring larger branches and trunks. The reason we do this is because when copper is bent, it actually becomes more rigid, meaning once it becomes bent, it holds its shape better. The other kind is aluminum. Now, aluminum is usually used for smaller branches, twigs, and wiring the roots down. Now, the reason we use aluminum is because when it bends, it actually becomes a little bit softer, meaning it doesn't damage new growth on smaller branches. Today we're going to be working on a Texas wax leaf privet. This is a relatively common variety of privet. It's a very hardy variety though. Now, typically you don't remove the tree from the pot to wire it, but for the sake of making a better video, we're going to. Now, the first thing you should understand about wiring a tree is how to gauge the proper wire to use. So, what we call a press test is you take a piece of wire, the potential wire to wire the branch, hold about 5 to 6 inches of it out and press it against the branch. Now, if the branch moves and the wire does not, then that wire is probably thick enough to move and to hold that branch. Now, if you take another piece of wire and press it against the branch and the wire moves, as you can see there, and the branch did not, then you need a thicker wire. What you want to do is use the smallest gauge of wire, the smallest thickness of wire possible on that branch. Now, this takes a lot of getting used to, but you eventually get the hang of it. The next question people always ask is, how do I know the length of the wire that I need? It's actually relatively simple. If you factor in the rolling effect of the wire, typically you only need to put another third of the length of the branch on the piece of wire. Now, you can actually measure it if you need to, or as you get more experience, you get very good at guesstimation. When you are wiring a tree, the first thing you want to do if you're going to be wiring the trunk is to work on the trunk. As you progress, you continue to wire further from the trunk. So we always start with the trunk, then the large branches, then the small branches, then the twigs, so on and so forth. Another thing that's very important is, if you're wiring this branch, when we wire with that branch pointing to us. Essentially, you wire in a spiral like this. If the branch is over here and you try to wire it, you have almost no leverage on the branch. If you're trying to wire that branch and it's in this direction, it's going to be cumbersome. The position that you keep it in keeps it so that you are less likely to damage the branch. Now, typically in your first wiring class, an instructor will teach you the bury method, or the buried method. Basically what you do is you take the wire, you place it behind the branch that you want to wire into the ground. This acts as an anchor. You then use the wire to wrap itself around the trunk and get to the branch that you want. The only problem with this method is if I'm trying to wire this one, I have to cross a fairly large trunk gap. We'll demonstrate that here, and why this method, though it's helpful at the beginning, doesn't usually work for most trees. Now, this wrap here, going all around this whole section here, is very weak. It's very unlikely that I'm going to be able to work the rest of this branch. So this is okay when you're working on trees that have very straight trunks and where you can wrap the wire very easily. But on anything that's more complicated, which is the idea that you want to go with, you don't want to work on it. You don't want to do it this way. So what we have here, and I kind of did this on purpose, is an example of bad wiring. You'll notice this section should loop here and come out like that. You want your wire to be at a 45-degree angle, which for most people just takes practice to get that right. You'll also notice that the spacing isn't the same. It gets smaller here, bigger here, even bigger here, and about the same here. These are things you want to avoid. Now, the one thing that was done correctly with this is it's wired all the way to the end of the branch. You don't wire to here and then stop. You don't wire to here, then put a different piece of wire. You'll also notice, one of the things done correctly, the wire is cut off on the end. You don't want it to stick out several inches and catch someone's eye. Now, you don't want to wrap it so tightly that it cuts into the bark. Now, we'll be talking about wire burn a little bit later, but that's what you're seeing here. The wire was wrapped on for so long, and basically it cuts into the bark. Same way that if you wrap barbed wire around a tree, eventually the barbed wire is inside the tree. Problem with bonsai is once this happens, it really never goes away. Now, again, keep your spacing good. Wire to the end of the branch. You want to keep it at a 45-degree angle, which this is not at. We'll show you an example of better wiring later. And what we're going to do now, so that you don't have to watch for, my guess, about half hour, we're going to record and fast forward. You can see me wire the whole tree. See you in a little bit. So you'll notice we did quite a variety of different gauges of wire and wiring methods on this tree. You'll also notice that not every branch is wired. We only need to wire the ones we need to move. So you'll also notice the branches are in exactly the same position. When you're doing wiring on a tree, whether you're wiring one branch or the entire thing, you wire everything you're going to wire and then you start moving. With the exception of if there's a branch really close, let's say these two guys are really close, and I needed to push this one out of the way in order to wire this branch. So if you need to get this one out of the way, wire it, move it, and then wire the other one, but don't place them for the actual wiring. Now, the way you bend a branch is pretty simple. So we'll use, let's see, we'll use this guy as the example. So if I want to move this branch up or down, doesn't matter, I need to find out where the actual movement is going to be. Now, I don't want to have the branch go at a downward angle at this point because there's a branch here. This is an area where this branch would come up and this branch would go down. Now, if I wanted to move it down here, I would hold this area firmly and then bend it down like that. You want to do this slowly so that you don't break the branch. Now, how you are actually moving it, the wire is only really a cast. Underneath the bark, underneath the cambium, on almost all branches and on all trunks, is what is considered to be sapwood or corewood. It's basically bone. When you move the branch, you slightly break that wood, very small cracks. The wire then stays on for about 4 months and acts like a cast. Once the wire is removed, the bone is healed, and it should stay in that position. Now, there's a couple other things you have to consider when you're bending branches. If you're making a bend here where the branch touches the trunk, if you make a downward bend there, it's very likely to break the part, to actually break the connective tissue there. With a lot of trees, a branch is like an arm, and this is the socket. It's very easy to break it out of that socket, especially if it's younger. So this branch is less likely to do that than this one coming off of this branch here, just because it's older and should be in a much more solid socket. The reason this happens is trees are actually meant to bend a little bit. They bend their branches, break a little bit so that the branch doesn't break off. Now, a few other things you have to consider when you're moving branches is if you move it too aggressively, you're likely to break the branch. You can, to demonstrate on something we had to cut off, I can bend this pretty easily, but if I start doing stuff like this, it's going to break. Now, if I come out here, take a straight piece like this, and do little breaks all the way down, besides the dead twig, we actually can get a lot of movement out of that. So, gentle and slow to move it. Now, I'm going to move all these branches. We're going to do another quick fast forward so you guys don't have to wait. We'll see you in a little bit. So what you have here is what is known as double wiring. Now what it means is when I originally wired this branch, this piece of copper wire was not thick enough piece to hold it where I want it to. So you run another line of wire directly next to it all the way back, starting from the same position and ending in just about the same position. You don't cross the wires. You never want to have wires going like this. It adds a pressure point underneath where they cross, causes a lot more of the digging in factor that we call wire burn. Now, you'll see with this wire coming down as well, it's actually a triple piece of wire that wraps all the way around. Now, you can continue to put pieces of wire next to each other, but the more that you do this, the more likely it is for there to be an undue amount of pressure underneath that wire, causing damage. Well, that's how you put the wire on, but putting the wire on is only about half of what you need to know when you're actually wiring a tree. One of the more important things to understand is how you take the wire off. Now, you've seen me use quite a few of these tools today. Now, each of them is good for a different gauge of wire. Smaller, smaller piece of wire. Bigger, bigger piece of wire. And by far the biggest is for the largest gauge of wire. Now, the way you remove wire from a tree is you just cut it off. Typically, you cut it off at every bend. So if you start on the left side of the bend, left side of the branch, cut the wire, cut the wire, cut the wire, cut the wire. Never unwrap the wire. There's a lot of bonsai artists that do this to save a little bit of money, but wire is not expensive enough to damage your tree. Just stop being cheap and just cut the wire off. Larger strands of wire can be reappropriated for different things. Even the smallest pieces can be used to wire the plastic screens at the bottom of the pot. Now, a few of the nevers you want to do. You want to make sure that you never cross wires. You want to make sure that you never wire down foliage or leaves. You want to make sure that you don't put wire in what we call the bend zone. Meaning, if my arm is a branch and we're wiring it, you don't put wire in what you'd consider to be the armpit if you're moving the branch down. This creates a pressure point and basically is a recipe for wire burn. If you're doing the same thing, if you're bending it up, you don't put wire on the shoulder because it's going to get in the way. After you've wired it, there's a few things you have to keep in mind. One is that you don't want to put it in strong sunlight. As I mentioned earlier, the tree being wired is actually a little bit of a traumatic event. So putting it in strong sunlight is kind of like taking yourself out of the hospital and jogging. It's not something you want to do. You also want to make sure that you keep it out of heavy wind, heavy frost, basically strong weather of any kind. Now, you don't want to fertilize for about 2 to 3 weeks after having wired your tree. The reasoning for this is the same. It's a bit too traumatic. The tree is going to recover on its own. You definitely do not want to repot the tree at the same time you wire it. Now, you can do a little bit of pruning on the tree. It's not recommended to do heavy pruning and heavy wiring at the same time, though. Now, people typically will shape their tree after they wire it. By that I mean you don't wire your tree after you've shaped it. You want to make sure the branch is in the right place and then you trim the foliage to match. I think that's just about everything you're going to need to know about wiring. We'll see you guys next time. Keep the questions coming and enjoy. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button, like the video, find us on Facebook. You'll find links to everything in the description below. If you have ideas for future videos or have questions, put them in the comments section. And if you feel like it, visit our online store. We've got trees, pots, t-shirts, all kinds of cool stuff. Alright, I'll see you next time.